You're the only one here, so now I don't have to talk to an empty room.
Okay.
Okay, oh, and here comes Chris. So as usual, you're going to make sure that you check these learning objectives at the front of the chapter. When we finish, you shouldn't be looking at these and going, I don't remember that, right? So they just give you a guideline. Hi, Chris. Did he come in? Did he get?
Yeah.
Oh, yep, he's there. Hurrah.
I got it safely.
Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 10. So we're going back to kind of nutritional ideas, but we're going to look at fluids and electrolytes, a little bit more on electrolytes than we did in chapter 9. And we should be doing this chapter today and Wednesday, and then Friday will be a review session. All right, and the exam will be next Monday. Okay? All right, so water, we often don't think of it as a nutrient because it doesn't have any calories or anything, but it's the most important one of the 6 that we looked at in chapter 9 as well. It maintains blood volume, serves as a solvent for proteins and carbs and vitamins and all the other things that we need. And it also plays a major role in our cooling systems. Okay? So when we look at solid foods, so at carbs and fats and proteins, we can go weeks, really, several weeks, without eating what we would think of as food. You're not going to be very well at the end of those couple of weeks, but chances are you'd still be alive. You can't go for more than a day, 2 days without water, okay? And when we're looking at water as a percentage of our body, drop it between 9 to 12% can be fatal. So there's not a lot of wiggle room there for us. Okay? So about 60% of our total body weight is water. Okay? And then when we look at the split amongst different tissues, muscle has much more water than fat does. Now, that imbalance there does give us a bit of an issue when we're looking at using bioimpedance for body composition. Means that we've got to make sure that we are hydrated when we take those measures. Otherwise, what happens is if we're slightly dehydrated, then it mismeasures how much muscle we have and it tells us that we're fatter than we are. Okay? So, using the bioimpedance is easy and quick, and it's getting relatively cheap, but we do have to make sure about those hydration levels. Women and the elderly have less water weight than a big, large male because we carry less muscle mass overall. And people who are obese, because they've got such a high percentage of their body composition is fat mass, their water percentage is very skewed. Okay? It's also really vital to physical performance. So at about 2% drop in water, we're going to see a decrease in endurance skills. And there's also some research to say even in something like basketball, there's a drop in the skill performance. Okay, so it doesn't, there's a very, very little amount of room, and it's even less than that for mental, for cognition, so about 1%. If you're about 1% dehydrated, then you start to have attention issues and memory problems. So not a good situation for coming to class, right? That's why I always encourage people to bring water with them to class. So, as with our calorie intake, we're also looking at a water balance, right? So we had that idea of the seesaw for our energy balance, all right? We've got a similar kind of situation when we're looking at water. So we take water in, obviously, as liquids, so milk, fruit juices, but also lots of the foods that we eat have an element of water, all right? So potatoes, for example, are around 75% water. Pizza, only 40% water, right? So that's why we have to have the ice cream afterwards and the wine. Keep up our hydration with our pizza. So we also make water when we're making ATP aerobically. So remember at the end of our electron transport chain, right? We kick out those hydrogens at the bottom, and if we don't have oxygen sitting there to pick them up, then we start to fatigue. But if we've got oxygen, we make water and we can just excrete it, right? So somewhere around 2.5 liters per day that we lose, which means we have to be very careful with making sure that we're balancing that with what we're taking in. And how much we lose is going to vary quite a lot on how much physical activity we perform, what the environmental temperature is like, what the humidity is like. So it's quite difficult to establish a set daily amount. All right, I know that some people say, oh, well, I've got my gallon jug. If I drink my gallon, I'm okay. Well, the gallon may be too much in certain circumstances, and it may not be enough in other circumstances. All right? So, you know, it's a good rule of thumb maybe to think about it like a gallon, but it's a little bit more variable than that. So we've got to be aware of that and keep track of it. All right? So we want to have a situation where our water intake is matching our water loss so that we don't have these cognitive impairments and we don't have physical performance impairments if it carries on. Okay. Some of the techie terms you're going to see, euhydration, so anything that has EU at the front means normal. So euhydration means I'm where I should be. Hypohydration means that my scale, my seesaw, has tipped the wrong way and we have an overall net water loss. All right? And then that's going to, if it continues, will lead to dehydration. So, water loss versus water ingestion, typically, right? We've got water loss as urine, and it's also eliminating metabolic and other waste products for us. Sweat, particularly if we're exercising, particularly if it's hot, particularly if it's humid, right? A little bit in our feces, and then insensible perspiration is like if you put your hand in front of your mouth and you breathe out, your hand feels a little bit damp. That's because there's water in the breath that we're breathing out, and that's our insensible perspiration. All right, so that means that we have here water loss anywhere from around 1,400 to 2,800 milliliters a day, okay? So that means that to rest and not do very much, we basically need almost 1.5 litres per day. Okay? Our water coming in, somewhere between 5 and 1,500 in liquids, depending on the foods. This is going to be up the higher end if you eat lots of fruits and vegetables, down the lower end if it's all cooked meats and fats, okay? Because you lose the liquid. Think about what happens when if you get a pound of ground beef and you brown it in the pan, think of all the water that you have to pour off, right? You lose all that water that was stored in the muscle tissue. And then our metabolic water, again, depends a little bit on if I'm an aerobic athlete, I might create a bit more than that. But then I'm probably losing more as well, right? So we want these two numbers to balance off. If my intake is larger than my loss, then urine output increases. Okay, so that up to a point isn't difficult to manage, and we just have to pee more, right? Sweat loss is an important clue to pay attention to. So I'll come back to that in a minute, because sweat loss can be quite dramatic under certain circumstances, and then you have to really be careful to make sure that you hydrate properly when you finished exercising, okay? If my intake is less than my loss, then we're heading towards dehydration and some health concerns and decreased performance if we're athletes, and eventually death if we don't get to water quickly enough. All right? So it really is crucial. Okay? I can't remember if I told you this story, but the last couple of summers, Brian and I, we like to go backpacking in the wilderness area, and we have hammocks that we tie up in the trees and sleep in our hammocks, and it's all peaceful and quiet and lovely. The last couple of years, we've done all the work and we've climbed up into the wilderness, and the springs have been dry. And so, you know, when you're climbing up something really steep, you kind of rely on the fact there's going to be water at the top, so you don't have to carry too much, because it weighs a lot, right? So we had enough water for the walk in, and there was no water at the spring, so we had to turn around and walk back out again, which was very disappointing. And that happened not this summer, because we didn't go anywhere because of coronavirus, but the 2 previous summers we've had so little rain here in New Mexico that there was no water in any of the springs that we tried up in the wilderness. So that was a bit disappointing. Let's hope we get plenty of rain and snow this winter. Okay, so I said we were going to look a little bit more closely at these electrolytes. They're a major factor in maintaining euhydration for us. All right? So the definition of an electrolyte is a mineral salt that dissolves in water, and then we get positive and negative ions once the salt has dissolved. So, for example, sodium chloride is a mineral salt. When it dissolves in water, we get sodium, which is a cation, positively charged, and chloride, which is an anion, negatively charged. All right? So they're important because water on its own doesn't really carry a charge, right? And remember that we've got all this excitable tissue everywhere. We need to be able to move an electrical charge along a nerve, over a muscle surface, all right, to keep things functioning properly. So not only does it not carry an electrical signal, it's not distributed very well throughout the body. Okay? So the role of the electrolytes, they're dissolved in the water, is to turn that fluid into something that will transport electricity. All right? And so they allow those electrical charges to occur in the nervous and the muscular system, in the heart, all right? And they also, we looked very briefly in chapter 9 at this osmotic pressure across a membrane. We were talking about drinking carbohydrate electrolyte drink, and we were looking at the molecules, the solute versus the water, right? So one of the other jobs that it does is to allow the cells to kind of move water around. So if the membranes are permeable, they tend to be selectively permeable, right? Remember we talked about a sodium and potassium pump when we were looking at, that would have been the chapter on the nervous system. Okay, so the electrolytes dissolved in the water allow there to be an osmotic pressure across the membrane. And when we did chapter 9, I tried to draw this picture. You might remember, it wasn't very good, but this is a much better version of it. All right, so remember our car on the hill, all right? The steeper the difference across the membrane, the faster the molecules will move, all right? Or the more the molecules will move one way or the other, okay? So what we have when we look at this diagram is in block A, we've got water on both sides of a permeable membrane, and the number of solute molecules is equal on both sides, right? So in this situation, the electrolytes and the water stay where they are, right, when it's balanced. Okay? Then in part B, we add more solute to the left-hand side. All right, so we add additional molecules. Remember, it's not the size of the molecules, it's the number of the molecules that counts. So we add more solute in on the left-hand side, and now we've got a situation where water follows solute. So what happens is the water from the right-hand side moves across the membrane into the left-hand side. All right? Eventually that will try to balance itself out. It can move in either direction, obviously, but it tries to go in the direction to balance out. So here now, this would be equivalent solvent to this side, right? The amount of molecules per volume of water is now the same on the left-hand side as it is on the right-hand side, right? So water will move to balance the electrolytes out, the ratio, right? Does that make a little bit of sense?
Sounds good to me.
So then, what happens in the cell is the cell doesn't directly manage the movement of the water, but the cells can control the movement of the electrolytes, and then that indirectly controls where the water is on either side of the membrane, right? So it's kind of a convoluted route to move water around the body by first moving electrolytes around the body. So we need this relatively constant concentration of electrolytes then to maintain nervous and muscular tissue function, all right, among others. Okay, so that balance is controlled by the kidneys and the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so the kidneys are the home for the adrenal glands. I think they sit on the top of the kidneys, if I remember a very, very long time ago at anatomy class. And so what happens is when we have, say, not enough sodium available, right? So the chemoreceptors would recognize that there was a drop in sodium for whatever reason. Then the adrenal glands will produce a hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb sodium from the urine. And at the same time, they excrete potassium. I'm not sure why keeping the sodium is important for muscle contraction. I don't know why we have to get rid of the potassium, but that's how that mechanism works. And then the GI tract is the point in your nutritional flow where the minerals are being absorbed through the wall of the small intestine. So again, it's very clever at identifying if we're low in a particular mineral, it will absorb more of that mineral from the food that you eat than it would on another day when you had enough of that mineral available, for example. Okay? So when we exercise, that increases the work of the kidneys and the small intestine, particularly if we're sweating a lot, right? And eventually, there'll be a point where the kidneys and the GI tract just aren't able to maintain equilibrium. And that's when we see dysfunction and injury and possibly death from dehydration, right? So it's possible in certain circumstances that supplements might be needed, although if you read the research in the chapter, they say it's got to be pretty extreme given our diet in the West, because we generally have so much salt in our diets anyway. It's got to be a pretty extreme situation to need to take a supplement of some kind. So they look at like ultra marathoners or people that are training for climbing Everest and things like this. And so they're putting in lots and lots of work. And even then, the need for a supplement is minor. So on the whole, we shouldn't need supplements. But there's always a caveat there, right? So, sweat's hypotonic. So again, if you remember back to chapter 9, that means that it has less electrolytes than blood does, but it still has some electrolytes. So it's still a mechanism for losing electrolytes out of the body. Again, if we're when we're just kind of hanging out, when I'm standing here teaching and you're listening, and or we're sitting at home doing our homework, right? You lose about 1.5 liters of sweat an hour. Probably a bigger person, smaller person will be a little bit less than that. But if we exercise in very, very hot weather, then we can lose a lot more than that. And again, an extreme number, but up to 4 liters per hour for an athlete who is working very, very hard in very, very hot temperatures, right? So just imagine 4 liters an hour, right? You've got to replace that to stay healthy, let alone to maintain the performance, right? So we'll talk more about acclimatizing to the heat in chapter, can't remember, 13? Can't remember. But when we acclimatize, a couple of things happen with this sweat rate, right? We start to sweat more, and we start to sweat earlier when we get used to exercising in the heat, okay? So we also see an increase in plasma volume and a reduction in electrolyte content as we acclimatize. So what that means, if you tie that all together, is that we sweat a lot more, but it's a lot less salty than we're maybe used to, right? You know, if you lick your hand when you've been sweating, it tastes salty. When we're acclimatized to the heat, it's less salty, even though I'm sweating buckets, right? So, I don't know, Molly, you're an outdoor athlete. Do you find it easier when it gets really hot in the summer to just stay outside so that you acclimatize a bit, or?
Absolutely, yes. If I'm doing something outside, I don't want to have to go in. If I go back in, I will not go back outside.
Yeah, because I used to find in Alabama in particular that I wouldn't have the air conditioning on in my part of the house and then I would sit in the sunroom where there wasn't any air conditioning. And then when I went to the playground to play with the children, it wasn't that bad, right? But I found that if I spent time indoors in the air conditioning, then when I went back to the playground, it was that much harder again. It felt hotter and more uncomfortable. Whereas if I just stayed in the heat, everything sort of evened out a little bit better. So I try to do that at home as well. I spend a lot of time in the sunroom where there's no air conditioning because Brian likes the air a lot. So, as I said, typically we have plenty of salt in our food, in the Western diet. You may possibly need a little extra salt on your food if you're training for long endurance events in the heat. Generally though, that loss of sodium in our sweat is compensated for very well by the kidneys and the GI tract. So, as I said earlier, typically we shouldn't need salt tablets or anything like that if we're doing something that's a manageable workload, right? If we're not going all out crazy, you know, running at 90–95% of our heart rate max in 100-degree weather, you know. So I don't know, Molly, that's interesting then. When you're competing, how long is an event? It's not very long though, right?
Usually, no, it's not. We tend to stay outside though, just because all of our friends are going, and so we just stay outside most of the time.
And when you're doing your actual, like, riding the horse and trying to catch the
calf, right?
Yeah.
I probably, like prep time from absolute start to like finish is probably like an hour.
Right.
Yeah.
So even that might not necessarily need a supplement.
No, not necessarily. No, it depends. Sometimes we go to barrel races and those can be all day affairs. In that case, I always want to have water.
So if you look at page 290, one of the best ways to keep track of your water loss when you're exercising, and it's the only time I'm going to tell you to use a scale, right, is to weigh yourself. Okay? So the idea is that you weigh yourself with no clothes on before you go and train. And then you go train, and you also keep track of how much fluid you drink while you're training. And then you come back and you dry off all the sweat, and you weigh yourself with no clothes on again. And you look at the drop in your weight. And what you have to think is that drop, the only thing that drop in weight can be is water. Right? So that's an important number to keep an eye on, because that means that you've now got to make up that water loss over the next few hours. Right?
That's funny. I never really thought of that because I was training a cult last summer. I guess it was the summer before the coronavirus, so like 2 summers ago. And he was very, very difficult. Like he was a workout for sure. And like at the end of the day, I'd always be like way lighter than I was at the beginning of the day.
Yeah.
I just thought it was because like I didn't eat enough at supper.
It's all that water, you sweat it out, you know. And so that means that at that point when you stand on the scale again and your weight has gone down, that at that point you're dehydrated, right? So you're not making such great decisions, you're at more risk for injury, so that's not a time to go and do a second training session. You need to spend some time rehydrating. And then they also talk here about calculating your sweat rate, because that can be beneficial if it's, you know, especially in climates like this where the temperatures change so much. You know, our sweat rate in the winter is relatively low, but our sweat rate in the summer is quite high, and because we're so dry here, we don't even know that we're sweating that much sometimes, right? It's not like being in the south where you know you're sweating because it's running in rivers down your body, right? So it's easy to not realize that you're getting dehydrated in this kind of dry climate here. So yeah, you can actually calculate that for yourself. And then the other tool we have is looking at our urine. Where's my, oh, that's in Wednesday's lecture. Okay, so the electrolyte content in the urine, as we've already said, you know, if your sodium levels are low in your body, then aldosterone will stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb sodium. So the content in the urine varies over time in an attempt to maintain equilibrium within the body as much as possible. When we exercise, as intensity initially increases, then sodium excretion decreases, right? And as the exercise gets harder, then we retain more and more sodium, right? So when we're working out pretty hard, it's somewhere around 10 to 20% less than 10 to 20% of what we're losing when we're at rest, right? So the body's working very, very hard to try to maintain sodium levels, okay? And when we do see a decrease in excretion during exercise, we've got a couple of things going on. Firstly, we are excreting less per litre of urine. And then we see an initial increase in urine output when we start exercising. But the more work we do, and as the intensity shifts into moderate and vigorous levels, then we see less urine output. And that maintains sodium as well. Right? Okay, one more slide, and then we'll call it a day. Any questions on that up to here?
I'm good.
You good? All right.
Yeah, I'm good.
So we're going to look at this idea of being thirsty because it's one of the very few things the human body has not developed to do very well, right? When you look at how amazingly our bodies maintain core temperature within a very small range of tolerance, right? And all these other, keeping sodium level and all these things that our body is able to do to keep us at equilibrium. When we get to hydration, we're really bad at it. So, being thirsty is your brain's way of telling you you need a drink, right? So you suddenly get this conscious awareness that you feel a bit thirsty, or maybe your throat feels a bit dry, okay? And that's a deliberate attempt by the central nervous system to get you to hydrate, okay? And that desire, that thirst, is controlled by an area of the hypothalamus that can sense, receives information from the cerebrospinal fluid, so it can sense concentrations and things like that in the fluid in your spine, and the hypothalamus can kind of keep an eye on what's your plasma level like, what's the osmolality, what are the molecules, the solutes, okay? And then when we lose body water, it increases the concentration of the plasma and the cerebrospinal fluid, and so the ratio, right, water to solute goes up, and the hypothalamus goes, hang on a minute, this isn't good, and it makes you feel thirsty, right? And then we have a drink, and eventually we'll not feel thirsty anymore because we're getting back into balance, right? So this is a problem, okay? Because if you think through that system, right, it means that in order to feel thirsty, I already had to have a loss of body water and a loss of plasma volume and a change in osmolality, right? So at the point that I feel thirsty, I'm already dehydrating, right? So I've already got that partial dehydration. So I've got that dry mouth. My eyes might feel a bit scratchy, perhaps, right? So our thirst, then, as humans, it takes a long time. Like we don't drink. When we get thirsty, we probably should drink a couple of cups of water, but we don't, right? We drink half a cup of water and then it sloshes around in your stomach and you're like, oh, I can't drink anymore right now. but then you realize you're still thirsty. If you have dogs at home, right, and it's a hot day and you're in the park or in the backyard and you're throwing the ball and the dog's running around like crazy and they're running and running and running and running and running, and then you put down a bowl of water, they don't come up for air, right? They put their face in the water and they just stay there until they've drunk what they need. They're very good hydrators. Humans are not good hydrators, right? And so if we are left to our own devices, we don't hydrate quickly enough, okay? So over about a 3-hour period, we may only get 70% rehydrated, right? So there's a couple of things we have to think about. One is try not to get thirsty in the first place, right? So you have to use all that discipline that you use in your training, all that discipline that we've talked about. Can we apply that to our nutritional intake and our diet, right? Can I be more careful? Can I think about how can I include more fruits and vegetables, think about how I can put more complex carbohydrates in and less saturated fat, right? How do I do that? We take that discipline and now we have to apply it to our water intake as well, right? So we should take a slug of water, and I'm awful at it, I have to say it. I have to actually put stickers up to remind me to have a drink, right? I'll get to the middle of the afternoon and I'll be farting around in the office and I'm like, why can't I get this done? I'm not cheap. And then I realize I haven't had a drink since breakfast, right? That's why I can't get anything done, because I can't concentrate, because I'm dehydrated, right? So we have to drink more than we want to, right? We have to drink more often than we want to. We need to not only drink during training, we need to drink before we go training so that we're more hydrated going in, right? Because that thirst mechanism is slow to kick in. And once it's kicked in, you're already looking at not having such a great training session, which is a shame, right? So, interesting stuff. Now I'm going to go home and drink like 3 glasses of water. No, probably not, but I'm definitely thirsty right now. And I did have some water before I came out, but apparently not enough. So, questions, comments?
It's interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah. It really, once you understand it, it will change your approach to your bottle of water that you carry around, I think. I really do. It's quite a fascinating concept. Okay, so on Wednesday we will finish this information in this chapter. Friday will be the review. All right, so I would recommend that you start taking a little look at the earlier chapters for this exam. Don't leave it all until the last minute. And then on Friday, if there's something you need for me to re-explain, we've got plenty of time. Okay?
Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Okie dokie. Well, have a lovely rest of your day. If you're in Portales, hang on to something when you open the door, because you'll get blown away.
It is very windy.
It's gone a bit crackers again. Hopefully this is the last day, because it's just too tiresome, this wind, when you can't go outside without like being blown over. So, yeah, and I'll see you Wednesday afternoon.
Sounds good.